All right, good evening, everybody. Uneducated Economist here. So, Warsh is about ready to really start putting it to the Federal Reserve's changing and the regime change and the new monetary policy that's coming from this new Fed chairman. Now, something that I have been trying to share here for quite some time on this channel is something called the credible threat theory. Now, when you think about what it is that Warsh is about ready to change about the Federal Reserve, he wants to get rid of something called the dot plot and the forward guidance. That's the talking about monetary policy to the markets out there to make sure that they are well in position for what it is that the Federal Reserve is wanting for their monetary policy, and ultimately delivering a message of expectation that the markets can then react to. So now, this is something that I think is very deep, it's very dark, it's very long, and it's very difficult for a lot of people to internalize. But once you see it, it becomes very clear and easy to understand. And to start this is to understand that Bernanke, like Ben Bernanke from way back early 2000s, recognized the problem that the Federal Reserve was going to face when hitting the lower bound to zero. And now this is ultimately the major problem that the Federal Reserve was facing, is that once you get to the lower bound to zero, no more downward adjustment can be made because the interest rates being paid are not going to be accepted at a negative interest rate. Once you hit the lower bound to zero, that is it. Now, here's the problem that most people are going to fail to understand about the inflation, deflation problem of the Federal Reserve. It's deflation that is the major concern for the Fed, is when they get to a point where they can no longer stimulate. This is what he has to say. A deflationary recession may differ in one respect from a normal recession, in which the inflation rate is at least modestly positive. Deflation of sufficient magnitude may result in the nominal interest rate declining to zero or very close to zero. That's when the Federal Reserve and the Fed funds rate hits the lower bound of zero. Once the nominal interest rate is at zero, no further downward adjustment rate can occur, since lenders generally will not accept a negative nominal interest rate when it is possible instead to hold cash. At this point, the nominal interest rate is said to have hit the zero bound. So now this is the major problem for the Federal Reserve that they were facing as a warning way back in 2000, early 2000. So it's not like they were caught by surprise by the issues that they were going to be facing. It goes on to say this: because central banks conveniently conduct monetary policy by manipulating the short-term nominal interest rates, some observers have concluded that when the key rate stands at or near zero, the central bank has, quote, run out of ammunition. That is, it no longer has the power to expand aggregate demand and hence economic activity. It is true that once policy has been driven down to zero, a central bank can no longer use its traditional means of stimulating aggregate demand, and thus will be operating in less familiar territory. The central bank's inability to use traditional methods may complicate policymakers' process and introduce uncertainty in size and timing of the economy's response to policy actions. Hence, I agree, the situation is one to be avoided if possible. So now he is warning the people, the other central bankers, in this speech, and again, this is delivered from early 2000s, that the Federal Reserve will have no way of stimulating the economy if they are at the lower bound of zero, and to avoid by any means necessary to achieve that. Do not get to zero by any means necessary. Stay away from it. Right? Goes on. Some observers have concluded that when a central bank's policy rate falls to zero, a practical minimum, monetary policy loses its ability to further stimulate aggregate demand and the economy. at a broad conceptual level, and, in my view, in practice as well, this conclusion is clearly mistaken. Indeed, under fiat, that is paper, money system, a government, in practice, with the central bank in cooperation with other agencies, should always be able to generate increased nominal spending and inflation, even when short-term nominal interest rate is at zero. So he is saying, yeah, even though you have taken the Fed funds rate all the way to zero, you can still stimulate aggregate demand. You don't have to take interest rates in negative territory. You have another option. The Federal Reserve is not out of ammunition. Here, he describes it. He describes it with a little parable, the conclusion that deflation is always reversible under a fiat money system follows from the basic economic reasoning. A little parable may prove useful. Today, an ounce of gold sells for $300 more or less. Isn't that incredible? This is from the early 2000s. $300. $300 more or less. Now, suppose that a modern alchemist solves his subject's oldest problem by finding a way to produce unlimited amounts of new gold at essentially no cost. Moreover, his invention is widely publicized and scientifically verified, and he announces his intention to begin massive production of gold within days. What happens to the price of gold? Presumably, the potentially unlimited supply of cheap gold would cause the market price of gold to plummet. Indeed, if the market for gold is to any degree efficient, the price of gold would collapse immediately after the announcement of the invention, before the alchemists had produced and marketed a single ounce of the yellow metal. This, right here, this hypothetical gold machine, is the power of the Federal Reserve when it comes to a monetary policy operating at the lower bound of zero. Using their words, they use the idea of a guy who invents a gold machine that's widely publicized and scientifically verified. Then they deploy that information in a profound way to the public that then drives the price of gold down before the guy produces a single ounce of the yellow metal in this hypothetical story. This is the forward guidance, delivering a message that the markets can react to. The markets are reacting to a hypothetical guy, to a guy who hypothetically builds this gold machine. Now, if that was real, in this hypothetical situation, people would lose their nugget. They would dump all their gold. They would be like, whatever, this guy can make as much gold as at will. This is exactly how it is that the Federal Reserve is conducting monetary policy. What has this got to do with monetary policy? Like gold, U.S. dollars have value only to the extent that they are strictly limited in supply. But the U.S. government has the technology called the printing press. This is literally Ben Bernanke saying this. This is deflation and how to prevent it from ever occurring here, November of 2002. The speech. But the U.S. government has the technology called a printing press, or, today, its electronic equivalent, that allows it to produce as many dollars as it wishes at essentially no cost. By increasing the numbers of U.S. dollars in circulation, or even credibly threatening to do so, the U.S. government can also reduce the value in dollars in terms of goods and services, which is the equivalent to raising the prices in dollars of those goods and services. We conclude that under a paper money system, and determined government can always generate higher spending and hence positive inflation. How many people were of the belief that quantitative easing 1, 2, 3, and 4 was going to cause a hyperinflationary scenario? I was one. It's one of the reasons why I even got into economics, was studying the whole idea of what the hell was going on with the Federal Reserve because of this massive money printing that they were doing. They took the Fed's balance sheet of $850 billion to over $4.5 trillion, and it failed to produce an inflationary scenario. The U.S. government has the technology called a printing press, or today its electronic equivalent, that allows it to produce as many dollars as it wishes at essentially no cost. By increasing the numbers of dollars in circulation, or even credibly threatening to do so. Most of those dollars sat on the big bank's balance sheet and never actually entered into circulation, but it was credibly threatened to do so. That's what drove the inflation expectations during the quantitative easing programs of 1, 2, 3, and 4 during the Great Financial Crisis. It failed to produce an inflationary scenario. Now, to understand what it is that the Federal Reserve was using for a tool, why they needed this tool, this hypothetical gold machine, which essentially is the forward guidance that they have developed to use as a tool to operate at the lower bound of zero. Ammunition, they ran out of ammunition, clearly mistaken, because they have this tool, this forward guidance. Now, we go to the next speech, which is monetary policy strategies for the low neutral interest rate world. Now, I've talked about this so many times in this channel that I will not let it go. If I could talk about this speech every single day, I would. John Williams dropped it. He dropped it right here for everybody to then internalize and understand the Federal Reserve's problem that they were facing, and nobody listened. It says it right here. Today we face an altogether different set of problems stemming from a very low neutral interest rate. That is, the short-term real interest rate consistent with an economy operating at its potential alongside low and stable inflation. Alongside low and stable inflation, ironically, the problem we need to solve these days is the risk of inflation that is persistently too low rather than too high. It wasn't just but a few years earlier, 17 years earlier than this, Ben Bernanke was warning about being at the lower bound of zero and what it is that they could use as far as tools to deal with being at the lower bound of zero and generating the inflation. Remember, we just said the central banking system and the government should always be able to produce inflation with the money printer. $4.5 trillion balance sheet from an $850 billion to $4.5 trillion failed to do exactly what it is that everybody knew was going to happen, and that was create the inflationary scenario. I thought it was going to. Everybody else I was listening to thought it was going to. It was obvious if you print up that much money, it was going to. The only people it wasn't obvious to was the Federal Reserve itself, who was saying, ironically, the problem we need to solve these days is a risk of inflation that is persistently too low. This is written in November of 2018, just after all the quantitative easing programs. This is a major problem for the Federal Reserve. So now they have a communication that they must deploy into the economy in order to maintain elevated inflation and inflation expectation. Remember, this is the problem they need to solve, is the risk of inflation that is persistently too low rather than too high. So now I'm going to take it to this final speech right here, because I'm only going to talk about those three. If you want the complete list of credible threat theory speeches, all these speeches that I have talked about here on this channel from all the different Federal Reserve officials that have been highlighted so that you can go right to where the important parts on those speeches are so you can internalize this stuff for yourself. There's a link down in the description to the school community. Join the channel, join the school community. You're going to get this information for yourself so that you can internalize it. Now, here it is. This is the best one out of all of them. Philip Jefferson communicating about monetary policy. This speech was delivered May 13th of 2024. This speech is absolutely the most telling of all the speeches that I've ever read about how it is that the Federal Reserve uses their communication more than anything else out there. This speech is entirely about monetary policy, and never once do they really talk about interest rate adjustments. Listen to some of the things that they have to say inside of this speech. This will blow your mind, because this right here is what Warsh is going to get rid of. Okay? This right here, what I'm about ready to explain to you in the next 5-10 minutes in this video, is going to be exactly what it is that Warsh is about ready to get rid of. Okay. Now, I'm not going to read the entirety of the speech, but I am going to read you a few sections of this. In 1981, Karl Brunner, the Swiss monetary economist, called central banking an esoteric art, and lamented central banks' inherent impossibility to articulate its insights in explicit and intelligible words and sentences. At the time, central banks' wisdom dictated that the monetary policymakers should say as little as possible. Some research of that vintage tried to rationalize this, quote, secrecy through the notion that monetary policy would be particularly effective if it surprised the markets. Now, this is the way that the Federal Reserve and all the central bankers around the world had always operated, is that they were very don't say nothing. One day you would wake up, you turn on the TV, you read the news, and the Federal Reserve had moved rates, and everybody was just so surprised by the idea. It was like, what in the hell just happened? Why did the Federal Reserve move rates? They would have to go and try and figure it out, because there was no explanation. It was just all of a sudden taking place. They would surprise the markets. This is the way that they used to operate. It goes on. Expectations became a focal point in academic and policy circles with the emergence of the new Keynesian models in the 1990s as a framework for monetary policy. In these models, aligning the expectation of decision makers, that's you and me, we're the decision makers. We're decision on investments, decision on our purchases, decision on everything that we do, business, startups, whatever. Decision makers in the private sector, again, that's us, with those of the policymakers, that's the Federal Reserve. Aligning the expectations of decision makers in the private sector with those of the policymakers produced superior economic outcomes. This is the Federal Reserve saying this, that if they align your ideas of what's happening with their ideas of what is happening, they give you this belief, this produce superior economic outcomes. Mike Woodford, one of the developers of the new Keynesian model, put it this way: not only do expectations about policy matter, but very little else matters. Expectations about policy matter, and very little else matters. Forward guidance. Remember, think about what it is that Ben Bernanke was talking about as far as the gold machine, and how important the message delivery system is. This is what Mike Woodford was figuring it out. During the tenure of Chairman Bernanke, there was another burst of innovation, the way monetary policy was communicated. Remember, Warsh is about ready to change this communication right here. This is what Ben Bernanke developed to deal with for monetary policy operating at the lower bound of zero. Remember, you said it was just like when you run out of ammunition, you're not out of ammunition. Let me tell you a story about a gold machine. Let me tell you about the hypothetically, scientifically verified and proven, widely publicized, drives the price of gold down. Ben Bernanke told that story years before the impacts of the great financial crisis. When the Fed took the interest rates to zero, they deployed forward guidance. Now, how do you get the message out to the people? Because nobody listens to the Fed. Most people don't even know who the hell the Federal Reserve is. How the hell are they going to get a message from the Federal Reserve when the Fed says, hey, yo, this is what we're going to do? And everybody was just like hearing crickets. They just heard noise. They didn't know what the hell the Federal Reserve is. There had to be a delivery message system, right? A message delivery system. There we go. During the tenure of Chairman Bernanke, there was another burst of innovation in the way that monetary policy was communicated. In 2007, the first SEP, Statement on Economic Projection, was published to convey systematically the economic outlook of the FOMC's participants. They didn't have this before 2007. Remember, Ben Bernanke gave the speech in 2002. 2006, rolling around, 2007, kicking into the great financial crisis, the first SEP was published to convey systematically the economic outlook of the FOMC participants, a delivery message system, right? Message delivery system. 2011, Chairman Bernanke started holding press conferences after every other FOMC meeting. That was in 2011, building this communication channels up, getting the tools ready. 2012, the Fed adopted an explicit inflation target of 2% and started publishing the individuals' FOMC participants' views on the appropriate future path of the Fed funds rate, now famously known as the dot plot. Right there. They didn't even have that until 2012. They didn't even have a 2% target until then. There was no such thing as a 2% target prior to 2012. It was some New Zealand economist or central banker who came up with the idea, said, hey, it's somewhere around here. Why don't we just go for 2% targets? Most central bankers shot for somewhere between 1 to 3, and 2% was just kind of a number. So when they say we're going for a 2% target, it was completely arbitrary. Completely arbitrary. It was just like, yeah, sounds good. And then started voting on what it is that they believe would be the appropriate path to achieve that 2% target, and then started publishing that to the people out there. That was the dot plot. Again, how do we get the information out there to the people? How do we scientifically prove and verify and widely publicize this information? Remember, you got to think about the gold machine, right? How does it happen? It happens with the dot plot. They developed this. Well, what are we dot plotting about? I don't know. Well, 2% sounds good. Okay, what do you think it's going to take to get to 2%? Right there. Deliver that message out there to the people, please. Right? That's the dot plot. This is what they were doing, right? Develop this. During these years, this is Loretta Lester, right? During these years, Loretta, in her capacity as the research director of the Federal Reserve of Philadelphia, contributed to ongoing work on communications in collaboration with policymakers and the Federal Reserve Board. Goes on to say this. Of course, this was an extraordinary time for monetary policy, as interest rates in most advanced economies were close to zero following the global financial crisis. So again, right, when you think about it, you run out of ammunition at the lower bound of zero. You have no way of stimulating the economy. And Ben Bernanke says, you have plenty of ways of stimulating the economy if you have a proper delivery system of messages that you can get out there to the people. You can then deliver these messages out there, promise them some certain particular features of the economy or of policy, align the decision makers in the private sector with the policy makers, and have superior economic outcomes. You see how this is going down? Remember, this is what Warsh is going to get rid of. All this stuff that I've been talking about, all this development, all this hard work that they put together to have this message delivery system, he's about ready to disassemble this. So he says. Think about how important this message system is. The FOMC, okay, hold on. Let me go back and read this. Of course, this was an extraordinary time for monetary policy, as the interest rates in most advanced economies were close to zero following the global financial crisis. The FOMC employed forward guidance, explicit communication about the future path of policy rate as a key tool. To deal with the unprecedented situation. The research community have found that such forward guidance could be very effective in the context of the new Keynesian paradigm. When Loretta became president of the Federal Reserve Bank of Cleveland in 2014, She's supported the continued use of forward guidance during these extraordinary times, in particular to communicate a lower for longer policy that could provide accommodation in the presence of the effective lower bound constraint. Just promise to stay low for longer, extra long for an extended period of time, and drive the inflation expectations. Stay low, extra long. Drive the inflation, make sure the job is done. Right? Sound familiar to what Powell did? Right? This is back in 2014. It was the same playbook, only a little differently. Again, promise to stay at the lower bound for extra long. She also insisted that, this is the best part right here. See, a lot of people say they're not using forward guidance. They are, or else Warsh wouldn't be trying to get rid of it. And Loretta said, she insisted that forward guidance could be used effectively even in normal times as means of clarifying the FOMC's reaction function. Don't think that they're not doing it. Those who think that the Federal Reserve is reacting to the markets are not understanding the forward guidance and how it was being used as a key tool and how effective it is and how the expectations of monetary policy means everything and very little else matters. That's what this speech, Philip Jefferson, just 2 years ago was communicating out there for the people to internalize. This is what Warsh is going to disassemble. Don't think it wasn't being used. This is 2 years old, this speech. They've been using this the entire time. They are not reacting. They are causing the markets to react to the words and expectations of the Federal Reserve. Loretta, as a member of the FOMC subcommittee on communications, developed and advocated for several proposals to improve communications. One proposal was to publish a measure of uncertainty surrounding the statement on economic projection forecast numbers. She was concerned that the uncertainty could be underestimated by the public if it wasn't communicated, that the public wouldn't recognize it. They didn't know how effective it would be unless it was communicated out there. They had to push the information, or else nobody would know. Nobody listens to the Fed. Nobody cares. You'd be like, hey, the Federal Reserve just said something, and they would be like, did you watch the fight last night? And that's the only thing they're going to talk about. They're not going to talk about what it is that the Federal Reserve said. Okay. This is the final bit of it here that I'm going to share with you guys. And again, if you want access to all the speeches that I've used to put this theory together, you have the link available down in the description to join the school community, to download the credible threat theory. You can take those PDFs and do whatever you want with them. Right? They're yours. Go have at it. Right? All right, surely, sometimes central bank communications can have unintended consequences. Let me give you 2 examples. First, there is always the risk that policymakers' statement about their economic outlook or their expected future path of the policy rate are interpreted by the public with the false sense of certainty. How many people fell for the dot plot? They say, oh man, the Federal Reserve has already put out their future projections on what it is. It's like almost written in stone. It's like that dot plot is not anything like that. It is far from being anything written in stone. For example, a data-dependent forward guidance announcement can be mistaken for a commitment to a fixed path of interest rates. Right? Data-dependent forward guidance announcement can be mistaken for a commitment to a fixed path of interest rates. People say, oh, man, they're committed to it. Right? Mistaken. When that interpretation is proven wrong down the road, it can create more volatility and uncertainty than if there had been no announcement. More volatility and uncertainty than if there had been no announcement. That is why policymakers always make sure to stress that they're data dependent of future policy. They've never committed to anything. Always data dependent. They always have been. That way they can change the way they vote, the way they act, the way they talk. We're data dependent. The data changed, and then they can just talk about what data it is they want to talk about in order to have a different view, right? Always data dependent. Second, it is possible that the public misinterprets the views of the individual policymakers as a committee view. What's Powell going to do? What's Warsh going to do? Is Warsh going to cut rates? There's an entire FOMC who's going to vote on this. One policymaker doesn't make any decision on as far as the interest rate of cut, interest rate rising, interest rate adjustments. They make no decision outside of the one that they vote on with 11 other voting members. Right? There is no person who's in charge of interest rates. That's why I just laugh when people say, oh, well, once Warsh gets in there, he's going to lower rates and do what Trump wants. So it's like, how does he do that? Does anybody understand how it is that he would do that? Because that doesn't seem to exist within the FOMC's monetary policy adjustment of interest rates, in the way that they handle the voting process of doing that is not something that he can do. What he can do is eliminate all this talking. Say, we're not going to do the press conferences, we're not going to have the dot plot, we're not going to do any of these things. That is something that Warsh can do. All this stuff that I have talked about so far, all these things, Warsh can eliminate. This is stuff that they have developed over the last 20 years to deal with the fact that they were operating at the lower bound of zero, because there's no monetary policy adjustment as ammunition that can be had at the lower bound of zero, but they are not out of ammunition. They have the ability to use credible threats. But if they eliminate the tools of credible threat usage, then how in the world do they operate at the lower bound of zero? They can't. They have no intentions on going back there. If Warsh removed forward guidance from the toolbox, they have no tool to deal with operating at the lower bound of zero. The only thing that could exist at the time is stablecoins, cashless society, and negative interest rates. The potential for misinterpretation is especially acute when many policymakers speak at the same time and disagree with each other. That never happens with the Federal Reserve. That is only recently. The dissent that has now taken place is some of the rarest things that ever occur within the Federal Reserve, and it was predicted by Philip Jefferson. I wonder what's really going on. I mean, here it is, Philip Jefferson was talking about something that doesn't really happen at the Federal Reserve, but yet now is happening 2 years later. Very interesting. Very predictive. All right? Says here, the potential for misinterpretation is especially acute when many policymakers speak at the same time and disagree with each other. The diversity of viewpoints among policymakers, again, very rare. Even at the time of the writing of the speech, it was very rare. Occasionally, right? One of them would pop off saying, I don't know if I agree with this. Many policymakers disagreeing with each other? No. Not a thing. Not a real thing that was happening at the Federal Reserve. Not typically. No, that was not what would really occur. But yet, Philip Jefferson kind of predicted that it would occur. Many policymakers speak and disagree with you. Okay, the diversity of viewpoints among policymakers lends itself to stimulating debates and ultimately better policy. Better policy. See, now people are hanging on every single word that the Federal Reserve does. Nobody has any idea if they're going to go up, down, or sideways with these interest rates. People have no idea on what it is that Warsh is going to do once he gets into position. And the only thing that he can really do is remove the tool of forward guidance. Yeah, there's some other things that he has, some other operation, things that can be different. But when it comes to the interest rate adjustment itself, there's an entire FOMC who votes on monetary policy, and that monetary policy can only work when it's not at the lower bound of zero. By removing all the tools of operating at the lower bound of zero, I can only imagine one of two events. The Fed has zero intentions on going back to zero, so we have inflation from here on, right? Forever inflation. Or stable coins, cashless society, and negative interest rates. That's it. All right, 35 minutes into it. Links are down in the description. Let's read a couple of these comments and then we'll move on. All right. The founding lawyers of 1787 knew exactly what we were doing and summarized it in the very first paragraph of their new corporate charter, Hologram of Liberty. Just saying, trillions are being gambled on AI centers that can't get electric or water. Not to mention, public support for AI centers are non-existent unless you are a corrupt politician, of course. QE requires the Fed to be at zero. I agree. Both sound awesome. Though it kind of depends on what you mean by QE. Yeah, and so, I mean, quantitative easing in the sense of what it is the, open, like the asset purchases of like the US Treasury on a continued basis. So like, we're going to buy, $20 billion worth of treasuries every month for the foreseeable future. Like that's kind of a quantitative easing. What we have experienced right now, as far as the liquidity injections that a lot of people are calling like continuous quantitative easing or money printing or QE right now, is not necessarily the QE in the same sense of what it is that they had done in the past. Because like the QE in the past was taking like the maturity on the treasuries out further, where what we are experiencing right now from the Federal Reserve is very short term. So everything they're doing is in a year or less. So whatever they do as far as liquidity injections right now would unwind itself within a year. If they stopped what they were doing, everything that they have done would be unwound in a year. And that is, to me, not the same as the quantitative easing that we had experienced when they took the balance sheet from 850 billion to 4.5 trillion or 4.5 trillion up to 9 trillion. Like this is massive balance sheet expansion. That's not the same thing that's taking place like right now with like making sure that the banks stay well capitalized and making sure that there's plenty of liquidity within the financial system. That's a different story. All right. Elon making like $150 billion a day for at least 4 days. God, can you imagine? Like, this is insane. Quantitative easing is like subsidizing our economy and propping up. Yeah. I mean, it's you have to think like the Federal Reserve is in a constant state of deterioration. And I don't know how many people quite recognize it because they really think that the Federal Reserve is out of control with the money printer. And I think that's probably more helpful of a mindset to the Federal Reserve than it is like one of countering, what it is that they're doing. The Federal Reserve and the balance sheet and everything they have on their balance sheet is generally going to mature over time. Like there is gold on there, so like that doesn't really mature over time and pay them off. But treasuries, mortgage-backed securities, these types of assets that sit on the Fed's balance sheet, these things have a maturity to them, and once they are due, that's money coming back to the Fed. And unless they take that and actively roll it back into the economy by buying more treasuries or mortgage-backed securities or something like that, that's money disappearing from the economy, from the financial system. It's literally, the Federal Reserve, like just sitting there, just letting their balance sheet unwind would be like deflationary all on its own, just them doing nothing at all. So when we think about like the Federal Reserve is out of control, I really don't think so. Like the Federal Reserve is in an attempt to try and provide enough liquidity to meet the demand that is existing throughout the entire globe, not just the United States economy and trying to deal with that, but then also trying to provide all the dollars that are needed to fund the debt that has been issued outside of the United States. And so as a lot of people just say, we'll just default on that debt. That's not our debt. It doesn't have anything to do with us. We didn't issue it. We didn't buy it. It doesn't have anything. We don't even know it exists. Like, it has nothing to do with the United States. These are entities outside of the United States, to countries, to people, to whatever, who have decided that they are going to write a contract that is due in dollars. That contract then gets used like dollars. When that contract comes due, it is due in dollars, US dollars. This doesn't have anything to do with the United States, except that if we do not have enough liquidity provided to the world to meet the demand to provide for all those dollar denominated debts, the strength of the dollar inside of the United States goes through the roof, destroys whatever exports we do have, and the entire global economy starts falling into depressionary effects. So this is a very difficult thing to try and hold on to, is being the world reserve currency, providing the world with enough liquidity to meet the dollar demand, while at the same time not destroy the United States people, society, with inequality. It's like it's almost an impossibility. It's not going to happen. Like, the inequality is definitely going to happen here. That's just all there is to it. And as people say, well, what is it that we can do to try and help the people? It's just like, they're like, that question, it can't be solved. There is nothing. And that's hard to accept for a lot of individuals, because they don't want to accept the fact that it's that way, but it is that way. And once you've accepted it as that, then it's easier to kind of figure out what it is you need to do about it. Knowing like what it is that Warsh is trying to remove from the monetary policy, the key tool to deal with monetary policy at the lower bound of zero, and an effective tool even when you're not in a moment of stress or recession or down at the lower bound of zero. Like, to know that this was a very effective tool that the Federal Reserve has been using and deploying for quite some time. How it has been used is ultimately what the credible threat theory has been explaining for all these years. Warsh is about ready to remove that, considering that the mainstream media has no clue about the credible threat theory and has really deployed more information about the Federal Reserve being reactive as opposed to using their words to manipulate the outcome. They're never going to see how it is that Warsh has removed it. They're still thinking well, the Fed's reacting, right? And since they no longer have a communication, what else would they believe? Oh, wow, man, I can babble. We're 40 minutes into this thing already. All right, what currency would use predominantly with the American dollar, without the American dollar? I don't know, probably the euro, but it doesn't really matter because there's no nation out there that's going to be able to provide the world with a safe and liquid asset like the U.S. Treasury. So it's you got to have a country that the people are confident enough in that they will get paid back, and have the gumption, I guess, to go deep enough into debt to provide the world with a safe and liquid asset. U.S. Treasuries, there's nothing else that competes. So if you were to remove the U.S. Treasury from the world reserve currency usage, you would be reliant on another nation that has the asset that would replace the U.S. Treasury. No nation has that. No nation is in deep in debt, providing a world with a safe and liquid asset like U.S. Treasuries with the confidence that they're going to get paid back like the United States has. And as people say, well, they can use all these other things, Bitcoin and gold and all that other stuff, there's not enough of it. That's why they use U.S. Treasuries, because there's plenty of it. And if you are thinking about all the transactions that occur around the world and how many are done in dollars, there is nothing out there that can compete against what it is that the dollar is doing. There's nothing that can do that many transactions. There is things out there like systems that can perform the amount of transactions, like make the communication happen. The problem that we will face is that those are limited currencies like Bitcoin or something of that nature, even in the digital gold aspect of it. If you use a limited currency, what you are going to do is you are going to find the people who are most industrious hoard all that currency for themselves, denying the rest of the ability to do transactions, and they will fall into pain and misery. It's the fact that we have an unlimited money supply that means we can have an unlimited amount of transactions. And as people hate the idea of the inequality it creates, they love the idea of being able to do whatever business transactions they want because there's plenty of currency to do it with. That's the problem we face. There's no other currency out there that can compete against what it is that the dollar's doing. There's things out there that would do a transaction. They just can't do enough of them because there's not enough of it. Yeah. And if you put it out there with, oh man, we can just divide the gold up into many pieces, you're right, you can. And all those little tiny pieces will get concentrated into the hands of a few, denying everybody else the ability to do transactions with. I put my TV out for sale, and now there's less gold out there to do transactions with. I have to devalue the price of my TV to 80, to 60, to 4. I'm out of business. Screw this. All right. You start denying the people the ability to do transactions because there's just simply no currency there and they have to take lesser amount for their products. Why be in business? Why are you going to go to work for less dollars an hour? That's what you would suggest or have to suggest if you are in a fixed currency like gold. Because as it gets hoarded away, there's less gold available for you to go work for. So if you want to work, you're going to have to accept less gold. And that's what happens when you have a limited currency like fiat, or not fiat, but Bitcoin or gold, right? Fiat is the unlimited currency that gives you unlimited transactions. But you're going to face major consequences from it. You face consequences either way. You just have to know how to position yourself accordingly for each one of those things. All right, moving on. So actually, the U.S. has everyone by the short hairs, pretty much. Uh, if we move it back up here a little ways. Elon is about the next greatest invention. He puts his money where it creates, not just grows. Great mystery, making America the great. All right. So, anyway, so for those of the people out there who are really studying the Federal Reserve, studying monetary policy, and to understand what it is that Warsh is trying to get rid of, is very important to understand how it is that they have been using it over these years, and then what that really means going into the future. Considering what it is that Philip Jefferson was talking about as far as the dissent that has taken place within the policymakers, to me, that is going to be something I believe is going to be a useful tool to them, as the people have no idea on whether or not they're going to be moving interest rates up or down or sideways because of the massive divide that is happening within the Federal Reserve monetary policy makers, the FOMC. To me, they won't have to communicate after that as far as what it is that they are going to be doing with their policy if they are attempting to stay still anyway. Like if they're in constant disagreement and they're like, hey, we voted this way, we voted that way, we tried whatever, but they can't seem to make the interest rates move because they're in this constant fighting back and forth. Think about what that can really mean for the Federal Reserve's communication out there. They don't even have to communicate. People will just start losing their mind over the idea that they are, dysfunctional. And then that'll really create inflation. It's just like you can almost see the story being set up to play out. Like it's not like they didn't warn us. They've been warning us the entire time. Even Jerome Powell said, hey, you're all going about ready. All the people who are at the end of the line, lost jobs and low incomes and stuff, you guys are about ready to really feel some pain. And that's crazy that he literally warned the people of that very thing before it happened. Nobody heard it. Like here, I'll prove it. Here, hold on one second. Where is it? Powell. August 27th of 2020. Literally, in this speech, it's just crazy to think that Um, Oh, here's something. So we were talking Ben Bernanke earlier about hitting the lower bound of zero. This is what he said in May. What is this? August of 2020. This is Jerome Powell. The decline in the assessment of the neutral Fed funds rate has profound implications for monetary policy, with interest rates generally running close to their effective lower bound even in good times. The Fed has less scope to support the economy during economic downturns simply by cutting the Fed funds rate. It just doesn't work. Right? He was warning about this back in August of 2020. Jerome Powell said the same thing that Ben Bernanke was warning about 20 years earlier. Right? 18 years earlier. The result can be worse economic outcomes in terms of both employment and price stability, with the cost of such outcomes likely falling hardest on those least able to bear them. So, he already said it. If we don't do something, it's going to be really bad, and especially for those who are least able to bear it. He then goes on to say, the persistent undershoot of inflation from its 2% long-run objective is a cause for concern. The Federal Reserve could not hit the 2% objective. All the quantitative easing, great financial crisis, and everything that came from it, right, failed to produce an inflationary scenario. This is what Powell was saying in August of 2020. He's saying, man, if we don't do something about getting away from the lower bound, it can create some very bad conditions, especially for those who are least able to bear the problem of that. He then goes on to say this persistent undershoot of inflation from the 2% objective is a cause for concern. Many find it counterintuitive that the Fed would want to push up inflation. I'm sorry, can you say that again? Many find it counterintuitive that the Fed would want to push up inflation. Yeah, everybody finds it counterintuitive that they would want to do it. Everybody except for the uneducated economist and the credible theorist, right? Credible threat theorist. After all, low and stable inflation is essential for a well-functioning economy, and we are certainly mindful that higher prices for essential items such as food, gasoline, and shelter add to the burdens faced by many families, especially those struggling with lost jobs and incomes. So he knew it. If we don't get off the lower bound of zero, it's going to be very difficult, very burdensome for those who are least able to burden this, to deal with the burden. It's going to be very painful for them. However, right? Inflation that is persistently too low can pose serious risks to the economy. And they know it's going to be a problem for those struggling with lost jobs and incomes. It was going to be a problem for you no matter what. It was going to be a problem for you if they did, and it was going to be a problem for you if they didn't. Did you ever think that maybe it didn't matter what they did? It was still going to be a problem for you? Because the wedge of inequality is going to get driven. It didn't matter what they did. Think about that. He literally said it in the same speech. The results can be worse economic outcomes in terms of both employment and price stability, talking about being stuck at the lower bound of zero with no way of downward adjustments. Right? This is a lack of inflation, deflationary scenario, stuck at the lower bound of zero. This can result in economic outcomes in terms of, or worse economic outcomes in terms of employment and price stability, with the cost of such outcomes, right, being stuck at the lower bound of zero, deflationary scenario, Federal Reserve can't stimulate the economy during a recession. This is going to be the worst for people falling hardest on those least able to bear them. So they know we can't be stuck at the lower bound of zero. The people at the end of the line will suffer the most if we do this. Can't be stuck at lower bound of zero. We have to find the inflationary scenario, or else it will pose serious risks to the economy, even though they know it will be a burden faced by many families, especially those struggling with lost jobs and incomes. They knew you were going to suffer. Right? He admitted that straight up and told the people, You're going to suffer if we stay stuck at the lower bound of zero. You're going to suffer. And we must find inflation. John Williams said it just a few years earlier. The problem we need to solve is the risk of inflation that is persistently too low rather than too high. Right? So we need to find this inflationary scenario, and they know it's going to be a burden on the families at the end of the line. It was going to be a burden on the families no matter what at the end of the line. No matter what path they took. So he admitted straight up, you, the people, those at the end of the line, those who are not asset holders, those who are wage earners, those living month to month are going to suffer in pain and misery. He said it. But nobody heard it. The Uneducated Economist has repeated this thing hundreds of times on the channel, warning the people about it. Nobody heard it. Nobody wants to hear it. Right? Nobody wants to hear the fact that they had warned them that they were going to do this. The Fed said it straight up. We want inflation. We want elevated inflation. We want persistently high inflation to get off the lower bound of zero. Yeah, it's going to be a painful experience for those at the end of the line. However, right, inflation that is persistently too low can pose serious risks to the economy. Inflation that runs below its desired level can lead to an unwelcome fall in long-term inflation expectations, which in turn can pull actual inflation even lower, resulting in an adverse cycle of ever lower inflation and inflation expectations. Big problem. Big problem for the Fed. Couldn't have it. You see what they did? How many people are hearing it? Nobody. Oh, the Federal Reserve caused all this inflation. Feel how painful it is. And I'm like, yeah, they warned you they were going to do this to save themselves. And every time you talk about how painful of an experience it is, it adds more power to what it is they need. It's crazy to see it this way, right? Why does the American banknote company print birth and death certificates? Yes, the more dollars out there in the world means the more percentage of primary dealing banks that own the Federal Reserve get to keep. Every dollar in existence was loaned into existence. Every dollar requires a dollar plus interest. So the system must grow. Tech and efficiency make prices lower, putting less demand on the money. Because the American Note Corporation got the contract for that. The world is a company. Wayne, thank you so much for the $2 support. Zeke has a good question, 5 or 6 up in the chat. Zeke. Thank you, Wayne, for the super chat and the hey Yui, can you and for the heads up on this. Hey Yui, can you simplify why the Fed wants inflation? I agree with you, but I struggle to explain to people why. Help me explain to other people why in a few sentences. Thank you. Love your content. Okay, that's not really possible to do in a few sentences because you have to think, okay, well, let me explain it to you in a few sentences, and this is going to be very difficult. So what I'm going to do is instead of trying to make it complicated, I'm just going to make it sound dumb by putting it into the voice of Spicoli. How does that sound? No, I'm just kidding. The reason why it's going to be hard to explain is because first thing you have to do is you have to explain the neutral interest rate, which is going to be incredibly impossible for you because most people can't even wrap their heads around what the Fed funds rate is. So if you can't understand what the Fed funds rate is, you'll never, ever going to understand what the neutral interest rate is. And so that part right there is going to mean that you're going to have to educate your audience, your person that you're talking to, the individual, about what the Fed funds rate is and then what the neutral interest rate is. Because once they understand what these two things are, it'll be easy to explain. But if you can't get past that part of it, the rest of it is just pretty much useless. So to understand what the Fed means by being at neutral, that's where the Federal Reserve is operating at its potential alongside low and stable inflation and full employment. Now, this is like a magic sweet spot for the Federal Reserve. Now, already this is getting pretty deep, right? I mean, if you understand the Fed funds rate, then you'll understand that if the Fed was operating or the economy was operating at its potential alongside low and stable inflation and full employment, the neutral interest rate would be very close to zero. Oh, my boy just got back. The Fed funds rate would be very close to zero, somewhere between 1% and 1.5%, 0.5%, 1.5%. They don't know exactly where that neutral rate would be, and they refer to this as R star. It's an estimate. Now, that's if the economy is operating at its potential alongside low inflation and stable inflation and low prices and full employment. And that's not where we're at. But that's the hypothetical spot that it would be if that magical experience was taking place within the economy. So now when we understand that the neutral interest rate is really low, like in the awesome sweet spot of the economy, the Fed funds rate would be very low. It would be close to zero. That right there is the major problem for the Federal Reserve. Not during the times when the economy is operating normal, everything's cool, right? Like, we got low and stable inflation, prices are normal, full employment, everything's cool. It's the moment that things aren't cool anymore. Unemployment starts to rise, inflation starts to fall, economic activity is slowing down. Now it's time for the Federal Reserve to stimulate the economy, okay? Typically, the Fed would want to lower rates. Here's the issue that they have. They take the rates to zero, and they're not far enough below neutral. That R star, the low R star environment, this does not give the Federal Reserve scope. In fact, this is the decline in the assessment of the neutral Fed funds rate has a profound implication for monetary policy, with interest rates generally running close to their effective lower bound even in good times. The Fed has less scope to support the economy during economic downturns by simply cutting the Fed funds rate. So now here it is. They got the Fed funds rate operating as potential. Everybody's cool, got a job, economy's chugging along, but then we have an issue. They lower rates, they hit the lower bound of zero. They're not far enough below neutral to actually stimulate the economy. This is where they were operating at during the Great Financial Crisis. This is one of the reasons why they weren't able to actually find an inflationary pressure from it. They were able to ease up financial conditions, like they were kind of got that part figured out, but it didn't create the economic activity within the financial pressures that they would typically see when everybody would go to work, because that money never really actually entered the system. And here's the problem that they really faced from it, is that it was the breaking down or the flattening of the Phillips curve. Right? Because everybody went to work at the end of the Obama administration all the way through the first Trump administration, massive people going to work, super low unemployment, and it failed to produce an inflationary scenario. So now the Federal Reserve is desperate at this point, right? Unemployment, like again, historically low, no inflation. Money printer go burr, no inflation. Massive forward guidance, no inflation. They were like, okay, crap, we're stuck at the lower bound of zero, right? Even at the, towards the end of, 2018, they were moving in. Remember, they had done this autopilot where they were going to let interest rates rise a quarter point every quarter for the foreseeable future, and it literally pissed the market something awful. They got the Fed funds rate up to about 2.5%, then they had to stall out. Still not enough, right? If they were to take interest rates back down to zero, it still does not stimulate the economy. They cannot get far enough below neutral. So this is a major problem that they were facing. They were like, okay, got to get off the lower bound of zero. How do we do that? Elevated inflation and inflation expectation by any means necessary. And a great way to go about this way is to go and look up something called the makeup strategy. Literally, that's what it's called. How robust are makeup strategies to key alternative assumptions? That document is huge, but it says this: makeup strategies work best when the public understands and believes and reacts to policymakers' commitment to offset misses in inflation from the 2% objective in the future. In particular, makeup strategies are most powerful when policymakers can influence the public's inflation expectations In doing so, policymakers face a dynamic tension. They must maintain long-run inflation expectations at 2%. How many people are convinced? 2% target, 2% target, while at the same time moving short-run inflation expectations in response to the new strategy. So now in this document right here, they spell it out. Average inflation targeting, pulling off the lower bound of zero, getting away from that, low R-star environment and maintaining elevated inflation was a key to maintaining a monetary policy. Returning back to the lower bound of zero is not an option. It's just not. So again, to simply explain this to somebody is to say the Federal Reserve cannot get far enough below neutral to stimulate the economy. Elevated inflation and inflation expectation pulls the Fed funds rate up to a higher neutral position so long as the inflation expectation is maintained. It's that simple. There's no simple way of understanding this. There's just not. And that's why most people end up falling for the simplest, easiest explanation. Money printer go burr, prices go up. Because to understand everything that I had just explained over the last 5-10 minutes it's almost impossible if you've never heard it before, right? You have to listen to this stuff over and over and over again because I have shared what it is that I have just explained to one of the guys at work probably 6-7 times. Every couple of months, I'll explain it again. Well, the Federal Reserve is going to sit still. The inflation expectation is going to rise. The real interest rate's going to fall, could even possibly go negative, and we're going to find the economy become stimulated. And he thinks about it. He's like, really? Very interesting. Then a couple of months later, he'll ask me, what's going on with the economy? And I'll say that exact same thing again. Because it doesn't change. The story is always the same, right? I don't change my view on monetary policy and how it is that it's being conducted until the changes happen. The inflation expectation is changing the monetary policy. It's lowering the real interest rates. It has been for quite some time. I've shared that with many people out there, and they just still wait for the Federal Reserve to move. And I'm thinking, you don't need to wait. You just need to see where it is that the real interest rates are headed. Huh? And again, to understand the real interest rate as opposed to the Fed's nominal interest rate, let's got to get educated again. What is the real interest rate? The interest rate after the inflation expectations. This is hard, right? It's not easy to internalize this stuff. So then we take it back again. What's the neutral interest rate? Are you talking about R star? The estimate of where the neutral interest rate would be when the economy is operating at its potential alongside low inflation with stable prices and full employment, that sweet spot? Is that the neutral interest rate we're talking about? Or are we talking about the one with the inflation expectations on top of it that has now elevated the Fed funds rate in order to remain neutral? If the inflation disappears, where does the Fed funds rate go to be neutral? Back to R star. With the inflation, elevated. Without the inflation, R star. You see, there's two ways of looking at the neutral interest rate. There's the neutral interest rate, the estimate, economy operating its potential, low inflation, stable in prices, and then you got the inflationary one that's built into it, which pushes the Fed funds rate up. Now, in order to be neutral, the Fed has to have elevated Fed funds rate. Lose the inflation expectation, Fed drops back down to R star to remain neutral. And that, right there, less than 0.5% of the people in the entire world would understand that. I seriously doubt, I would doubt I doubt 1% of the nation knows that. I really do. That's one of the reasons why the channel like a lot of people have a difficult time following the channel as much as we do is because I am not going to stop talking about that stuff. I can't. Like anything else is secondary. It's symptoms. It's pretty much noise comparatively to what it is that the Federal Reserve is doing with the Fed funds rate and the expected inflation expectations. It's just like there's really nothing else to look at. I mean, outside of like what those things would do to influence the expectations around, around it, like tariffs or war or independence or something of that nature. Those things are important to the expectation, but it's really like every time somebody says, well, what about this, what about those things, what about, all these craziness that's happening, and I'm thinking, well, you tell me, man, what do you think it's going to do for your inflation expectations? Oh man, they're going to cause things to go way up in price. Well, I'm assuming the economy is going to get less restricted due to the fact that the Federal Reserve sitting still, and your inflation expectations, along with everybody else, is probably going to raise that neutral interest rate, may even make it go into a negative real rate. And we will find that the asset holders are kicking ass, going out there consuming like crazy, and it'll be a resilient economy. That's what I think. What do you think? Right? Thank you guys so much for all the super chats, too. And thank you, Wayne, for giving me the heads up on that one. We got Michael. Where are my glasses? All right. Thank you so much for the $5. All major economic events are bubbles. Tech, early 2000, subprime, 2008, COVID bubble, 2020. Now it is biggest AI center bubble in the trillions. Yeah, I don't know. Like, I, I keep thinking about the bubbles. Like, wasn't it just 10 years ago we were hearing about the everything bubble? Like, everything's going to pop, right? The everything bubble, it's all like going to crash. Didn't Michael Burry, like, I don't know, a while back, did a single tweet, sell? All right, everybody sell out now because we're in a bubble, about ready to pop. Did nothing but go up ever since. I do have to wonder sometimes, malinvestment. Yeah. Um, an overbuild, such as what we had experienced during the prior to the great financial crisis. Lots and lots of building taking place, houses that were being built that were never ever going to get paid for, right? But yet the economic activity of the purchasing of the material, the actual, labor of going into it, there was a lot of economic activity that happened to something that was never ever 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 going to get paid for. Now, that was something that Michael Burry definitely recognized. But to recognize like all the bubbles that will take out the economy, that will crash or, force a failure. The problem that I think a lot of times we see is that we think about a bubble popping and then assume the effects from that will be similar to what it is that we had experienced from the past. See, like when we've had like market crashes or like, the events of failure, the major problem that we would end up facing within the economy is people would lose their jobs. And now this is the critical feature within the economy that was most upsetting to the policymakers, to the people themselves, to the government, all that. When people lost their jobs, it was devastating in just about every way. And now the major problem with it is that our jobs was the production, right? So back in the day when we produced stuff, that was where we got our money from. And if we weren't working, weren't producing, where do we get our money from, right? And so when we lost our jobs, we lost our means of production. Now, when we think about how much we worked, what it is that we were doing with those jobs is we were also the consumer. The economy was in both the production and consumption. And as we moved more into a consumption-based economy, the production of it wasn't necessarily as important as the consumption part was. And this is really where we started to like feel the pain of an economy that suffered when people lost their jobs, is that they lost their jobs and weren't able to consume. which meant that we lost even more jobs. So we had to figure out how to keep the consumption going. The production didn't do it, right? We used to be able to go out there and produce and then try to sell that production and make some money off of it, but then that started to fade away. Cantillon effect, foreign, the exporting of manufacturing. This is an unfortunate consequence of the ever increasing amounts of new money that pours into the system. Now, whether it was done by money creation through central banking or just being really good at manufacturing, it doesn't really matter. It still goes down the same way, and that is the ever increasing amounts of money that pours into the state, right? Raises the standard of living. Once you have raised your standard of living, it makes it very difficult to compete against other people out there who are going to make the same things you do, but they're going to do it a lot cheaper. So now you don't have an economy that can then ramp up off of production. You have to ramp up the consumption in order for everybody to have a job. This is one of the reasons why we are now going to face the consequences, is because even if you ramp up everybody's job, you used to go out there and be the consumer, that doesn't happen anymore. You can give everybody a job and they don't go consume. You can give everybody raises, give them a lot of money, give them stimulus packages. It doesn't really increase their consumption that much. Where all the consumption is now happening is at the top. And so when we think about it in this fashion, man, this really leaves the people out of the game. Like all the consumption, all the economic activity, all the asset allocation, all the benefits of inflation, all that goes to the top. All the pain and misery of it goes to the bottom. And this is now the state of affairs that we are in. And there's really no returning back to the old ways. If we fail to be a consuming nation, then the whole economy starts to collapse. How do you get the consumer to consume? Well, it ain't going to happen with the wage earner. So where's it going to happen? It's going to happen up at the top, the asset holders. Not good. All right. So is it bubble? Well, I think about it. It might have been a bubble that would pop back in the day when the wage earner couldn't go and consume, because then the consumption would start to fall. But now, whether you consume or don't doesn't really make any difference. Right? Dang, man. That sucks. All right. Well, I've got my ass itches and fingers smell like that. Okay. Well, I'm gonna move on. That was horrible. Why would you comment such horrible things? All right. Yui, would you be interested in a Fed chair position if offered to you in a fantasy world? No, not really, Zeke. To be honest with you, I'm not sure what it is that I would do to try and benefit the world with a monetary policy that is inevitably going to cause inequality. Like, I don't know, tell everybody that's going to happen and then take advantage of my position. I mean, I don't know what it is that I would do with that other than, like, be firsthand view of the inequality that would happen from it. There's nothing that the central bank can do to lessen it, except for just disappear. Like, I mean, I guess they could do nothing at all, sit on their hands, watch their balance sheet unwind, and then watch the deterioration of the economy fall into complete collapse. At that point, there would be a lot more like level playing field that has no real value to it at all. Does that sound? I don't know how to quite explain it, but like, if you were to crash the economic system right now, it's not like the people here are productive enough to produce anything for themselves. So if you're not buying it from a foreign producer, what's the existence here going to look like? It's going to be pretty deteriorated, except for the few people who actually can afford to buy from the foreign producers, which will only be essentially the handful of asset holders who are left. So if you destroy the Federal Reserve, yeah, that's going to be a very painful experience for probably a good generation or more. And then if you don't, we're going to find ourselves in higher, deeper inequality. So it's like at this point, there's no good real way of dealing with it. And so if somebody was just like, dude, how would you fix this? Like, I'm not. I'm not. And nor neither are they, and neither will you, or neither will anybody else. Uh, um. Okay, this is a pretty good question. Simon, do you believe what the Fed Reserve is saying, or do you believe they are lying to us? About what? Which part? I mean, which part are you talking about? Because the Federal Reserve talks about many different things. I mean, I read from all the different Federal Reserve speeches, and many of them disagree with each other. So, who is it that you're talking about when you say the Federal Reserve is lying? Yeah, like to about what? I mean, they seem to have been telling the truth the entire time. I don't know what it is that other people have heard, but I know a lot of people have gaslit themselves saying money printer go burr, prices go up. So, what is it that the Fed is lying about? They seem to be pretty honest. Donald Trump has got to go. Okay. They talk word salad. I don't think they do. I mean, they're very clear. Look at the speeches that I've left. I mean, they're very telling, very straightforward, very deliberate, right? I mean, the problem we need to solve these days is a risk of inflation that is persistently too low rather than too high. How clear of a message could that have been, right? We know it's going to be a problem for the people at the lower end suffering with lost jobs and wages. How clear of a message could that have been, right? Operating at the lower bound of zero is not an option. How clear of a message could that have been? Like, these things are very clear. It's very difficult to understand it through the Fed speak if you don't understand the Federal Reserve and the meanings and the context and all that other stuff. That part is hard. But once you hear it, see it, and understand what it is that they're talking about, they are very clear in their communications. They are not misleading in any way. The mainstream media message, if you're listening to the Federal Reserve through the words that are being spoken on CNBC or Bloomberg or Wall Street Journal or any of that stuff, then I can understand why you would be very confused, because that message delivery system is part of the makeup strategy. They were going to use the mainstream media manipulation tactics in order to create the narrative that they were looking for. But when I listen to the Federal Reserve, I'm not listening to the mainstream media. Never. Ever do I do that. Like, I will bring up mainstream media articles and say, hey, look, Loretta, whatever, they were speaking in this one. But when I talk about the Federal Reserve and the FOMC and the members, I go to their speeches and literally break down their words, right? And listen to what it is that they have to say to the other central bankers out there. Because that is the real communication of the Federal Reserve, not the mainstream media. That stuff, that's like holograms on the wall or something. I don't know what that is, I know what it is. It's forward guidance. It's, it's the credible threats. It was all a big hoax. Trump never sent anybody to round up all these illegal aliens in the New Mexico, that's for sure. Gas prices and wars, tariffs, just Trump taxes. Regular gas here in West Virginia is down to $3.36. Wow. Man, it's $5 a gallon where I'm at. Driving home from showing 800K fixer in San Diego. It's so nice to sell houses in. Wow. Trump says we're going to get rid of all these illegal... Okay, I'm moving on. I'm talking monetary policy. I'm not talking politics. And, I mean, you guys can talk about what it is that he said, she said, that never comes up. Like all those people who keep advancing the taco trade, only make it more potent for them to actually benefit and profit from. I can't believe that the taco analogy, like, I can believe it, that there's the taco analogy. What I'm like totally amazed at is that the taco analogy, I didn't get credit for it. Right? Because I was saying before he was even president, they're going to be using their words more than their actions to manipulate market actions, right? Trump always chickens out. There's a trade, literally, trade strategy based around him throwing a threat out there, a credible threat, only to remove that threat and then find the markets reacting to it. Like, You know, I was like, is that not the credible threat theory? Yeah, you know, I mean, it's this little piece of it, you know, as far as how that is manipulated. But good Lord, I mean, it was just like they came up with this whole taco analogy off of it. And I have had this credible threat theory in motion and play and theory and discussion for literally years now. Yeah, and it's just like, oh, well. Yeah. Uh, mm, Taco is a great meme. It was a great meme. It worked out well. Why do you think there's a disconnect between mainstream media news and the Fed speeches and the? It's because exactly what I've been saying, Zeke. What they have is they have two communication styles. One that they deliver and communicate to the other central bankers, and then they have the mainstream media narrative that they are attempting to control. Right? Like think about it. They printed up from the Great Financial Crisis a balance sheet of 850 billion to 4.5 trillion, and it failed. Failed to produce an inflationary scenario. Now, this is a problem for them. So now they had to figure out a way to create an inflation that was going to be expectation. Inflation, inflation expectations, the real economy. These are different things. Even, hold on, let me bring up John Williams' speech because he actually breaks that down and says it. Hold on, let me find it. Um, where is it? There we go. The downward shift in inflation expectation has a second round effect on real interest rates, the economy, and inflation. See that? See how he separates it? The downward shift in inflation expectation has a second round effect on real interest rates, the economy, and inflation. When policy is constrained by the effective lower bound, the downward shift in inflation expectations raises the real interest rates, further diminishing the degree of monetary policy. So if you have this downward shift in inflation expectation, you will raise the real interest rates. This is why it's so important to control the narrative. When you put it out there to the mainstream media, man, inflation go burr, prices go up, and you make sure that everybody knows it, even though deep back at the Federal Reserve, they're like, God, I hope this works. I hope we get the inflation. I hope we get it, boys. I hope we get the inflation. Because they just went through all this massive quantitative easing and it failed to produce an inflationary scenario for them. The downward shift in inflation expectation raises the real interest rates, further diminishing the degree of monetary stimulus. That blows people's minds when they figure it out. It was like, how in the world is that possible that the downward shift in inflation expectation then diminishes the degree of monetary stimulus? If you raise the inflation expectation, you will increase the degree of monetary stimulus. So now, how do you control this? Through mainstream media narrative. It's the only way. They even have ways, like they even talk about, do I have it here? Hold on. Maybe I do. I don't know if I still have it here. Let me back this up. The role of inflation expectations in monetary policy. Anyway, I can't find it right now, but there's all kinds of documents talking about how it is that they were going to control and essentially use the mainstream media, music, videos, Facebook posts, you know, Twitter posts, stuff like that, in order to create the narrative of elevated inflation and inflation expectations. Like they literally talk about that very thing. Anyway, here. The role of inflation expectations in monetary policy delivered May 15th of 2023. Just go read that document, right? And then it'll talk, this is the reason why once you start reading through this is why I have been so adamant about like becoming a member of the channel and following these Fed speeches, because once you start listening to the different members of the FOMC and the words that they use. What up, sir?
Hey, got you some tea.
Oh, thank you.
Yeah.
Hey, appreciate it, man.
Yeah.
You want to say hi to everybody?
Hey.
So, right on, man. What are you guys doing?
Just hanging out.
Yeah, I'm gonna be done here in just a few minutes.
Okay.
What movie are you guys gonna put on?
We have My Girl.
Oh, that old one?
Macaulay Culkin.
With Macaulay. Yeah, right on. That's an old movie. That's a good one. Okay, cool. So, once you see like how it is that the different FOMC members are communicating about monetary policy, and then you get a kind of an understanding of what it is that they have said to the other central bankers, and then you watch them go out on mainstream media, and then they don't talk about any of the good key points that they had brought up inside of their speeches. You think, man, why didn't you talk about these particular things? Right? Why didn't you bring up certain facts about like how it is that the neutral interest rate is really being like pushed higher on the inflation expectations? The way they talk about it is so esoteric. Like even Jerome Powell says, oh, well, we're at the high side of neutral. Nobody knows what that means, right? But yet you will find other economists out there who are going to say that the Federal Reserve is intending on, overly restrictive or, stupidly accommodating. They don't think about it in the neutral interest rate position. Alrighty, guys. So, what are the implications of getting rid of the forward guidance on the market? Well, I mean, I'm only assuming that with the massive diversity within the viewpoints of the FOMC members, that the use of forward guidance in the traditional sense will be eliminated with the dot plot, but they are not going to end the communication. Like that void will be filled with something, right? I mean, you can't just remove the communication and expect people not to talk about it, not to be curious, not to search for the information, and then on top of it, not expect the professional economist out there to be delivering the message. Like you think about it, this is like credible threat going to be pushed into steroids. Instead of having a deliberate message communication system, it's going to be left up to the wild, creations of whatever fantastic fantasies of pure imagination that people come up with, but they won't have any alternative to look at. That's going to be crazy to think about what it could be like. So what are the implications? It could be huge, right? So we know what it is that they are intending on doing. We can only assume a lot of those things. But knowing exactly what it is that they are getting rid of as opposed to believing that it didn't even exist in the first place, I think is a good way to start, is to understand what it is, right? Because like, how would you know what it is he's getting rid of if you didn't know, if you didn't even think it was, if you didn't believe in it, I mean, how many people are assuming that the Federal Reserve is being reactive to the economy, but yet here it is, Warsh is saying, well, we got to get rid of this forward guidance. It's too disruptive. It's just like, to what? Everybody thinks that you're being reactive. How could forward guidance possibly be disruptive if you guys are being reactive? Because they're not. They're delivering a message that with intent for the markets to react to. Oregon been hot last couple of days. It really has. UE, do you think so many economists get it? Why do you think so many economists get it wrong? And other thoughts? I really don't know why so many other economists have chose to move down the path of whatever view that they have taken. I mean, even the idea, like, here you got Gunlock, who's supposed to be like the bond king or whatever. And he's talking like years ago about how the Federal Reserve is bumping around like Mr. Magoo. And I'm like, dude, Are you trying to? I mean, are you adding to the Fed's pressure? Are you trying to like increase the inflation expectation to benefit the Federal Reserve's monetary policy? Because that's exactly what you are doing. It sounds ridiculous, but yet everybody who heard it was just like, "Oh yeah, the Fed don't know what they're doing. They're crazy. They're stupid. They don't know." And I'm thinking, "Oh, so you're gonna fall for that too, huh?" So why are they getting it wrong? I don't know. I have no idea. Like, how is it that the uneducated economist, in my opinion, has accurately called out the Federal Reserve like for years now? When it comes to like even when they were had their Fed funds rate at their all-time high, I was doing an interview with Zuber, and he says, "Do you think the Federal Reserve is going to be cutting? What if the unemployment rises to this 4.5%? They're going to be forced to cut rates by all this other stuff." And all these things that were coming out in the mainstream media. I wasn't like picking on Zuber for that. He was just repeating things that the headlines in the mainstream media. And I said, yeah, well, you might find the Federal Reserve lowering interest rates a little bit to establish the credible threat, but they are not going to be dropping interest rates that much. That's exactly what happened, right? They lowered rates with the credible threat that they would do it more into the future, and everybody was anticipating it. That's all they needed to do was establish the credible threat. They weren't intending on lowering rates anywhere. They don't want to move. Moving the adjustment of interest rates is not an effective tool. All right? It just doesn't work like it used to. And so, as people, I think, misunderstand how it is that the Federal Reserve conducts their monetary policy, I think they're literally just stuck in an old school way of thinking. And since they didn't, like, I learned about monetary policy from reading the Fed's speeches themselves. I didn't learn from an economist. I didn't learn from a course. I didn't learn from a class. I didn't learn from anything else. I learned from the Federal Reserve itself. That's where I learned monetary policy. I don't know monetary policy any other way except for the delivery message of the FOMC's own words through their speeches. That's where I learned monetary policy. And so when people come to me and say, "Oh, dude, you got monetary policy so wrong," and I'm thinking, well, I don't know how I could possibly have it wrong. I didn't learn it from anybody else other than the policymakers themselves. Everybody else learned from some economist or some class or some school or some book, right? I learned from the FOMC themselves as they were delivering the message. I would read it, not understand what the hell they were saying, read it over and over and over again, and break down all the little words that they were saying within these speeches. And I did that over and over and over again as the speeches were coming out until I figured out monetary policy. So, how is it that the other economists got it wrong? I think that they were literally just educated from a base that has changed. Right? And they're like, hey, we understand this base of how the economy works, how the Federal Reserve adjusts rates, how they, deal with, problems within recessions and employment and stuff. And they all learned how they deal with the economy and monetary policy and the financial system. They learned that, took the test, passed the test, got their degree, and then they went with it. And they said, okay, this is how it works. Me, on the other hand, I was reading, okay, zero lower bound. What the hell does that mean? Fed funds rate. Okay, blah, blah, blah. So that's how I learned. And so when, other people say to me, it's just like, dude, you don't understand the Federal Reserve's monetary policy. And I'm thinking, I don't know how I could understand it any other way. Like, how could I misunderstand it if I didn't learn it from anybody else? It was like, I could understand if I learned it wrong from somebody else, but I got it directly from the Fed. Yeah. All right. No, the neighbor over there. Well, they're mowing some of the lawn, and then they had some like kind of weeds up along the fence line over there that they were taking out. In the Pacific Northwest part, the lawn is a rainforest. Oh man, like Freddie mowed the lawn just the other day. It already needs to be mowed again. I just remember Janet yelling, thinking, "Follow that bird." The Federal Reserve owns the Pentagon, and the Pentagon has their little talking heads. Weeds, I got weed. All right. Trying to guess, please speculate. So here's the thing. this is what I really honestly think of the Federal Reserve and what it is that they plan on doing for the future. They plan on sitting still. They don't really want to adjust rates. If they do adjust rates, it's going to be very little more to establish the credible threat that they're going to do it some more. Now, even if they did adjust rates, even if they took rates to zero right now, it's going to take a year at least to have a full impact on the economy. So a year to a year and a half down the road, we can see where those interest rate adjustments are actually going to be impacting the economy. So as most people are thinking, man, what is the Fed going to do about all this situation we got going on right here, right now? And I'm thinking probably nothing, because there's nothing they really can do. Everything that they do takes 6 months to a year or longer, right? Just to even show up, it takes 6 months. It takes a year to have an impact. So now this is something by the Fed's own words. There is a lag to the interest rate adjustments. So when you look at this, you have to look at it in a couple of different ways. You have to think about it from the Myron point of view. Remember Myron? He was Trump's pick. He went up there and was going to cause the Federal Reserve to be all disrupted. He was only there for a short amount of time. It was very temporary. But if you listen to his argument on why it is that the Federal Reserve should lower interest rates to zero immediately, it's a really telling argument. It's really good, right? But you have to understand what it is that he was communicating and the idea that there is a lag to the Fed funds rate. So if you adjust it to zero right now, it's going to be a year before you find the impacts of that. So lowering interest rates, whether you take it to zero or not, just lowering interest rates significantly, taking it to say even 2%, you got this lag period that's involved. If you have a situation in which that the inflation expectation falls almost immediately, the war comes to an end, there is no tariffs, Fed independence goes away, everybody's lining up thinking, the same way, there's no worries, the mainstream media is coming out and just screaming everything is awesome, right? And now, if you have that sort of scenario that is taking place, right? And you have the Federal Reserve, who is then in an attempt to then try and follow that inflationary scenario down. If they are not already in position, then they will find an incredibly restricted economy until that lag period catches up. So if they wait for the inflation to go away and then they adjust rates, they will be restrictive in the economy for over 6 months to a year. All right. This is what's crazy about it, is that if you can see that, then it makes sense on why Myron would want to cut rates immediately. He sees the inflation going away. So if that's the camp you're in, that all this inflation is going to go away, we're going to find ourselves back at target, the 2% target, like they've ever been there before. But whatever, if you believe that to be the case, then you also would probably be in the same camp of drop the interest rates immediately. Because by the time the inflation has disappeared, you're going to want to already be in position because of that lag. So if you cut rates now, 6 months to a year down the road, when the inflation is finally disappearing, it would be in perfect line with the Federal Reserve's lag period when it comes to that interest rate adjustment. Does that make sense? Like all that, lining up like that? So for Myron, that makes sense. And that might be the camp that you're in. It's like, yeah, the inflations go away. It's going to be back to 2%. If the Fed doesn't adjust today, they're going to miss the boat because there's the lag period in there, and they're going to end up being incredibly restrictive to the economy, even though the inflation is gone. Then inflation's not going to go away, and it's going to end up sticking around for a while. And if that's the camp you're in, then the Federal Reserve has to maintain the elevated Fed funds rate. And if the inflation does stick around for a while and even goes a little bit higher and the Fed doesn't move at all, we could find the economy becoming accommodating, right? Quite opposite of what it is that people would have anticipated. So if you do not lower the Fed funds rate immediately today in hopes that the inflation is going away, so that 6 months to a year down the road, these two line up together so you don't find any restriction taking place within the economy, right? That's a very difficult thing to perform, because if you lower rates now, you're going to send inflation through the roof. So the Federal Reserve can't lower rates to then time it properly for an inflationary scenario that could possibly disappear. Like that's a like how what in the world? Talk about like, being able to like be like the crystal ball of like, future predictions. How in the world do you do that? Guess on when the inflation is going away and then time it 6 months to a year ahead of time so that the lag period from the interest rate adjustments will line up with the disappearance of the inflation at the same time? No way. What's probably going to end up happening is the Federal Reserve is going to keep the Fed funds rate elevated and inflation expectations will run persistently within the economy, one scenario after the other, forever. Well, not forever, but for a while, as long as they can. Because those are like, which one sounds more likely of an achievable task? Maintaining inflation expectations, super easy. Mainstream media does it for them. People do it to themselves, so that's pretty easy too. Or timing a lag period from an interest rate adjustments within the Fed funds rate to a disappearance of inflation at some point in the future. Which one is the more likely, like, one that's going to be an achievable task? I'm assuming the elevated inflation expectation and a Fed maintaining its position, letting the mainstream media push inflation expectations with one scenario after another. Like that's just what we've had. So why won't we have more of it? Right? All right. I saw Jerome Powell say in 2024 that wages will adjust in 4 to 6 years. That means the plan is not for inflation to necessarily go down, but stay and wages adjust. We never go back to 2010s. Yeah, and it doesn't really matter. Like, the wages are more of just a relief for the individual to feel better about the situation, but it doesn't really create inflation. So whether or not you're working or not, that isn't really not that much of a concern to the Federal Reserve. I mean, it is a concern to the Federal Reserve because they have the dual mandate part of stuff, right? You're supposed to be like, working, and then the Federal Reserve is supposed to be somewhat responsible for you having a job. But there's nothing in there that says your job is supposed to be a good job or a high paying job or a living wage job. It just says a job, and that, as long as you have a job, you're not unemployed, and that's the best that they can offer. So, there was a time back in the day they would be very concerned about you having a job. And if you had like inflation that was running high, they would try and create a situation in which that unemployment would rise. They literally had something called the neutral employment rate. Much like the neutral Fed funds rate, they had a neutral employment rate where things like if the employment was lesser than the neutral rate, then you would find inflation running high. If unemployment rose above the neutral rate, then you would find the inflationary pressures coming down. And then there was a neutral employment rate where this was the sweet spot of people working. If this was like, the sweet spot, there wouldn't be like the inflationary pressures nor a deflationary one. But now you can have that neutral interest rate, or right now, the neutral unemployment rate is like really close to like it's super low. You can have everybody like you can have unemployment at 2%. It wouldn't matter. You can have like no unemployment whatsoever, and it doesn't create an inflationary scenario. Back in the day, it would have created inflationary. It would have been inflationary. But you can't get far enough below the neutral unemployment rate to actually stimulate the economy with the falling of unemployment or the rise in wages. It's just not in the cards anymore. It's not part of the economy. It used to be, but it's not anymore. All right. We got to call it good here. let's see, what time is it? I might give it another few more minutes. Okay. Interesting. Yeah, I mean, well, thanks. Inflation expectations, I don't think will ever go down because prices are never going to go down either. I mean, they do go down in some stuff, right? I mean, we watched lumber prices drop dramatically. They're only now getting back to where they were pre-pandemic. Right? 650 per thousand was the pre-pandemic high. They're at 630 per thousand right now. Some stuff doesn't, some stuff didn't go up. Yeah, and lumber's still not there yet. It did for a while during the supply chain shortages. And the only reason why we're having prices move up on lumber now is, again, because of supply. It doesn't have anything to do with demand or money printer. So, I mean, it's like, that's why I don't look at inflation the same way that a lot of other people do. People look at inflation as just solely off of the money printer, and I'm thinking that's not it. Inflation is done by consumption, supply-demand imbalances. And this is something that Cantillon tried to describe a long time ago, that just because you double the money supply doesn't mean you're going to double the price of everything out there. It's like where that money enters and how that money enters, that's the important thing to look at. Because just because everybody ran out, like, the way I kind of look at it is like, if everybody in your neighborhood all of a sudden just got $100 or $1,000, it doesn't matter, right? Everybody just got $1,000. Some people are going to take it and invest it. Some people are going to pay off debt. Some people are going to go and party with it. Some people are going to, whatever, save it for, like, they're going to do all kinds of different things. Some people are going to notice that the new money came in. The restaurants might notice it, like some other luxurious thing might, notice that, this new money has come into the existence, into the neighborhood. You're probably, unless there was some sort of message that was delivered out there, you're probably not going to find people taking their $1,000 and going down and buying up toilet paper. Unless somebody told them there's going to be no toilet paper there. But if they got $1,000, the last thing on their mind is to go down there and buy, like, oh man, $1,000. You know what? I'm going to go get some toilet paper, right? No, right? They're not. They're going to think, man, I'm going to go get a ribeye. I'm going to go take off and go enjoy the weekend. I'm going to go and put this into the Dow. I'm going to, pay off some debt. But I doubt they think, man, I'm going to go buy $1,000 worth of toilet paper and not have to worry about toilet paper for the next year or two or whatever. I mean, it depends on how big your family is. But that's, you see, the point that I'm making on it is that when you bring the new money in, you have to think, where does the new money enter? Is it going to enter all channels equally? No way. Not even close does it enter all channels equally. People make decisions on with that differently. And when you find people then start moving into luxurious experience with it, like buying fancy things or whatever, most likely, unless somebody tells them that there's a shortage, they're not going to be buying simple necessities like toilet paper. And so the new money isn't going to go flying into toilet paper. It's probably going to go flying into ribeyes. All right, kids keep toilet paper houses on the block. I'm like, did they forget? All right, I'm scary when it's scary. There we go. It's scary when they can't control where you spend your money. That will truly frightening. Hot and now, what does this say? Hot now was so amazing as a lower middle class kid. Supply demand imbalances are created by money printing, though. No, that's not true. That's not true. Because if that was the case, then the quantitative easing of 1, 2, 3, and 4 would have produced an inflationary scenario, and it failed. So that's not true. Right? I mean, you can say it simply and then, find evidence of that happening in certain circumstances, but then you will have a very difficult time understanding or explaining why it is that the quantitative easing of 1, 2, 3, and 4, taking the balance sheet of $850 billion to over $4.5 trillion, failed to produce an inflationary scenario. Like, you can't do that. If you use that argument, printing money causes inflation. No, it doesn't. Bringing in money increases consumption, but if the new money doesn't increase consumption, it will not create inflation. That's why a balance sheet expansion of trillions of dollars failed to do it, because it wasn't going into consumption. It's super important to look at it that way, because if you just fall victim to money printer go burr, prices go up, you'll never, ever, ever be able to see the monetary policy. You just can't. It just won't be possible. And you can work really, really, really hard to try and see it through that way. You won't. It won't be possible. All right. Do you think real estate or stocks are more valuable in our economy? Cantillon speaks of landlords. Uh, More valuable in our economy. What do you mean by more valuable in our economy? More valuable than what? Than before? Or like, I'm not sure what you mean by more valuable than not having it. I mean, I'm not like, I'm a little confused by what the more valuable part is. Yeah. Like, should you be in it or shouldn't be in it? Like, I'm. Do you think negative interest rates will be in our future within 10 years? I think the possibilities of that are very real. It seems to me that they are already setting up the mechanisms in which to deploy a negative interest rate environment, mainly having stable coins. Um, Once that is up and running, the stable coins are, then the capabilities of taking the economy into negative interest rates will be a lot more effective and possible. So when you think about what it is that Warsh is doing with the removal of forward guidance, then either they don't expect on going back to the lower bound of zero, or the lower bound of zero doesn't matter, right? So, I mean, there is that third path, right? Like, I mean, when you think about it, it's like if they have removed the language and the tools of dealing with the economy or dealing with monetary policy at the lower bound of zero, it either means one of two things. Either one, they have no intentions on going back to the lower bound of zero, or two, the lower bound of zero doesn't mean anything to them anymore. Now, in order for it to not mean anything anymore, they have to have some sort of e-currency. Now, that's by their own words, the IMF. Stable coins will totally do it. So, is it happening in 10 years? I think the capabilities of it are there. Will it be there? I don't know. I mean, I guess it would have to depend on like what we end up seeing as far as deterioration within the economy itself. Um, so like I wouldn't put it out of the realms of possibilities, but that seems like a fairly quick timeline. Uh, Okay. Without constantly increasing the balance sheet, we would not have inflation. With constantly increasing the balance sheet, we didn't have inflation. So okay, so think about your statement here. I'm going to move on beyond this because there's no point in this. But think about what you just said. Without constant increasing the balance sheet, we would not have inflation. With constant increasing of the balance sheet, we did not have inflation. Quantitative easing 1, 2, 3, and 4 failed to produce an inflationary scenario. If you cannot figure that out, why? Then you're never going to be able to figure out what the next step is in monetary policy. So you're going to have to step back and then reevaluate what was going on during the quantitative easing programs of 1, 2, 3, and 4 that failed to produce the inflationary scenario, and why it is that John Williams wrote a speech, Monetary Policy Strategies for a Low Neutral Interest Rate World, in which that he described the situation that we are facing, in which that inflation was running persistently too low rather than too high, even though they had just done all this money printing, right? With the constant increase in the balance sheet, it failed to produce an inflationary scenario. So try it, right? Try to figure that out. Uh, the inflation is fraudulent, manipulated. They just lying, UE. All right. Is that the case with negative interest rates? Do you think gold will skyrocket? I do. Yeah, I mean, I think gold is just going to go up anyway, just because of the fact that it's a limited, a limited commodity, just like anything else out there of limitation, is that once you start concentrating it into the hands of the few, the rest of the available amount of it out there only becomes that much more valuable. Here's the thing. If you want, like, I'm not trying to push back against anybody who wants to feel the pain of the money printer go burr and the prices go up because it's such an easy thing to feel mad about. That's cool. Like, if that's the direction that you want to take your understanding and the meaning and the economic, positioning that you want to hold for yourself, if that's the internalized information that you want to use is one that the money printer is causing the inflation, then go for it, man. I mean, Peter Schiff is right around the corner over there, man. He can explain it to you in great detail. Now, if you want to truly understand how the Federal Reserve was failing to provide an inflationary scenario to save their monetary policy, even though they had just gone through all this massive money printing, then you're going to want to stick it out here on this channel to understand what was going on with the low neutral interest rate environment, R star, and how it is that they were going to solve that problem. Because as you push the inflation and inflation expectation, the money printer go burr, prices go up, you are literally hand feeding the Federal Reserve all the power they need. And I don't know if you can see that or internalize that. And I know the pain of what it is that you're experiencing from the inflation wants to give you the ability to point the finger at somebody and say, hey, this is your fault. And I know exactly what's doing it. It's the money printer, right? And so when you're trying to, push out and, project this problem out there onto them saying, hey, you did this, you're forgetting that internalizing the problem is the only way that you're actually going to truly deal with it. Because once you recognize what it is that's going on, yeah, inflation sucks for me. I hate it. Why is this occurring right now, considering some of the things that are happening from the past? Now, I could say it easy. Money printer go burr, prices go up. But then there's another thing to say. The Federal Reserve tried that and it failed. What is it that's going on right now that's totally saving their monetary policy? Because remember, they're in a good place. Right? They ain't failing. They figured this part out. And every single time I think about what it is that they were looking for and needing, I hear the money printer go burr, prices go up argument, and that the balance sheet expansion is causing the inflation, and on and on and on and on and on. And I'm thinking, okay, back in just a few years ago when they had that same situation, it was failing them. And what they really needed was people's expectations to be elevated. There it is, out into the economy. Money printer go burr, prices go up. Federal Reserve, you guys giving each other high fives, aren't you? You guys did it. Critical. I didn't think you could. There it is. All right. What time is it? Oh, I got to go, guys. Uneducated Economist. You let me know.